Edward V was King of England from his father Edward IV's death on April 9, 1483 until June 26 of the same year. He was never crowned, and his 86-day reign was dominated by the influence of his uncle and Lord Protector, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who succeeded him as Richard III on 26 June 1483. This was confirmed by the act entitled Titulus Regius, which denounced any further claims through his father's heirs. Edward and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, were the princes in the Tower who disappeared after being sent to heavily guarded royal lodgings in the Tower of London. Responsibility for their deaths is widely attributed to Richard III, but the lack of any solid evidence and conflicting contemporary accounts suggest four other primary suspects. Along with Edward VIII, and the disputed Matilda and Jane, Edward V is one of four English monarchs since the Norman conquest never to have been crowned. If he died close to the time of his disappearance, he is the shortest-lived male monarch in English history. His great-nephew who was crowned, Edward VI, died in his 16th year. Early life: Edward was born on November 2, 1470 in Westminster Abbey. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had sought sanctuary there from Lancastrians who had deposed his father, the Yorkist King Edward IV, during the course of the Wars of the Roses. Edward was created Prince of Wales in June 1471, following Edward IV's restoration to the throne, and in 1473 was established at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh Marches as nominal president of the newly created Council of Wales and the Marches. Prince Edward was placed under the supervision of the Queen's brother Anthony, Earl Rivers, a noted scholar, and in a letter to Rivers, Edward IV set down precise conditions for the upbringing of his son and the management of his household. The prince was to arise every morning at a convenient hour, according to his age. His day would begin with matins and then mass, which he was to receive uninterrupted. After breakfast, the business of educating the prince began with virtuous learning. Dinner was served from 10 in the morning, and then the prince was to be read noble stories of virtue, honor, cunning, wisdom, and of deeds of worship, but of nothing that should move or stir him to vice. Perhaps aware of his own vices, the king was keen to safeguard his son's morals, and instructed Rivers to ensure that no one in the prince's household was a habitual swearer, brawler, backbiter, common hazarder, adulterer, or user of words of ribaldry. After further study, in the afternoon the prince was to engage in sporting activities suitable for his class, before evensong. Supper was served from 4, and curtains were to be drawn at 8. Following this, the prince's attendants were to enforce themselves to make him merry and joyous towards his bed. They would then watch over him as he slept. King Edward's diligence appeared to bear fruit, as Dominic Mancini reported of the young Edward V. In word and deed he gave so many proofs of his liberal education, of polite nay rather scholarly, attainments far beyond his age. His special knowledge of literature enabled him to discourse elegantly, to understand fully, and to declaim most excellently from any work whether in verse or prose that came into his hands, unless it were from the more abstruse authors. He had such dignity in his whole person, and in his face such charm, that however much they might gaze, he never wearied the eyes of beholders. As with several of his other children, Edward IV planned a prestigious European marriage for his eldest son, and in 1480 concluded an alliance with the Duke of Brittany, Francis II, whereby Prince Edward was betrothed to the Duke's 4-year-old heir, Anne. The two were to be married upon their majority, and the devolution of Brittany would have been given to the second child to be born, the first becoming Prince of Wales. Those plans disappeared together with Edward V's reign. It was at Ludlow that the 12-year-old prince received news, on Monday 14 April 1483, of his father's sudden death 5 days before. Edward IV's will, which has not survived, nominated his trusted brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector during the minority of his son. Both the new king and his party from the west, and Richard from the north, set out for London, converging in Stony Stratford, Buckinghamshire. On the night of April 29 Richard met and dined with Earl Rivers and Edward's half-brother, Richard Grey, but the following morning Rivers and Grey, along with the King's Chamberlain, Thomas Vaughan, were arrested and sent north. They were all subsequently executed. Domenico Mancini, an Italian who visited England in the 1480s, reports that Edward protested, but the remainder of his entourage was dismissed and Richard escorted him to London. On May 19, 1483, the new king took up residence in the Tower of London, where, on June 16, he was joined by his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. The council had originally hoped for an immediate coronation to avoid the need for a protectorate. This had previously happened with Richard II, who had become king at the age of 10. Another precedent was Henry VI, whose protectorate had ended with his coronation aged 7. Richard, however, repeatedly postponed the coronation. On June 22, Ralph Shaw preached a sermon declaring that Edward IV had already been contracted to marry Lady Eleanor Butler when he married Elizabeth Woodville, thereby rendering his marriage to Elizabeth invalid and their children together illegitimate. The children of Richard's older brother George, Duke of Clarence, were barred from the throne by their father's attainder, and therefore, on June 25, an Assembly of Lords and Commons declared Richard to be the legitimate king. The following day he acceded to the throne as King Richard III. Disappearance. After Richard III's accession, the princes were gradually seen less and less within the Tower, and by the end of the summer of 1483 they had disappeared from public view altogether. Dominic Mancini recorded that after Richard III seized the throne, Edward and his younger brother Richard were taken into the inner apartments of the Tower, and then was seen less and less until they disappeared altogether. During this period Mancini records Edward was regularly visited by a doctor, who reported that Edward, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. The Latin reference to Argentinus Medicus had previously been translated to mean a Strasbourg doctor. However, D. E. Rhodes suggests it may actually refer to Dr. Argentine, whom Rhodes identifies as John Argentine, an English physician who would later serve as Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and as Doctor to Arthur, Prince of Wales, eldest son of King Henry VII of England. Edward and his brother Richard's fate after their disappearance remains unknown, but the most widely accepted theory is that they were murdered on the orders of their uncle, King Richard. Thomas More wrote that the princes were smothered to death with their pillows, and his account forms the basis of William Shakespeare's play Richard III, in which Tyrrell murders the princes on Richard's orders. Subsequent re-evaluations of Richard III have questioned his guilt, beginning with William Cornwallis early in the 17th century. In the period before the boy's disappearance, Edward was regularly being visited by a doctor. Historian David Baldwin extrapolates that contemporaries may have believed Edward had died either of an illness. In the absence of hard evidence, a number of other theories have been put forward, of which the most widely discussed are that they were murdered on the orders of the Duke of Buckingham or by Henry Tudor. However, Pollard points out that these theories are less plausible than the straightforward one that they were murdered by their uncle, who in any case controlled access to them and was therefore regarded as responsible for their welfare. Bones belonging to two children were discovered in 1674 by workmen rebuilding a stairway in the tower. On the orders of King Charles II, these were subsequently placed in Westminster Abbey, in an urn bearing the names of Edward and Richard. The bones were re-examined in 1933, at which time it was discovered the skeletons were incomplete and had been interred with animal bones. It has never been proven that the bones belonged to the princes. In 1789, workmen carrying out repairs in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, rediscovered and accidentally broke into the vault of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. Adjoining this was another vault, which was found to contain the coffins of two children. This tomb was inscribed with the names of two of Edward IV's children, George, 1st Duke of Bedford, who had died at the age of 2, and Mary of York, who had died at the age of 14. Both had predeceased the king. However, the remains of these two children were later found elsewhere in the chapel, leaving the occupants of the children's coffins within the tomb unknown. In 1486, Edward IV's daughter, sister of Edward V, Elizabeth, married Henry VII, thereby uniting the houses of York and Lancaster. Ancestry, Portrayals in fiction. Edward is a character in the play Richard III by William Shakespeare. In film and television adaptations of this play he has been portrayed by the following actors: Kathleen Yorke in the 1911 silent short dramatising a part of the play. Howard Stewart in the 1912 silent adaptation. Paul Hewson in the 1955 film version, alongside Laurence Olivier as Richard. Hugh Janes in the 1960 BBC series An Age of Kings, which contained all the history plays from Richard II to Richard III. Nicholas Hernal in the 1964 West German TV version Car Paragraph Nick Richard III. Dorian Ford in the 1983 BBC Shakespeare version. Spike Hood provided his voice in the 1994 BBC series Shakespeare, The Animated Tales. Marco Williamson in the 1995 film version, alongside Ian McKellen as Richard. John Plummer in the 2005 modernised TV version set on a Brighton housing estate. Jermaine de Leon in the 2007 modern-day adaptation. Edward has also been portrayed by Ronald Sinclair in Tower of London, a 1939 horror film loosely dramatising the rise to power of Richard III, and by Eugene Martin in the 1962 remake. Jonathan Soper portrayed him in the Who Killed the Princes in the Tower episode of the BBC drama documentary series Second Verdict in 1976, and Timothy Cresta played him in the 2005 British television drama Princes in the Tower. Edward is a character in the fantasy novels To the Tower Born, a novel of the Lost Princes by Robin Maxwell and Sent. In the anime Black Butler, Edward and his brother are presented as ghosts haunting Ludlow Castle. Edward is voiced by Mitsuji Seiga in the original and by Josh Grell in the English dub. In Josephine Tey's classic 1951 detective novel, The Daughter of Time, Inspector Alan Grant occupies his convalescence by investigating the alleged murder of Edward and his brother. In the 2013 TV series The White Queen, an adaptation of Philippa Gregory's historical novel series The Cousins' War, Edward is played by Sonny Ashburn's Circus. References: Ashley, Mike. British Kings and Queens. Carolyn Graff. ISBN A0-7867-1104-3 ppA 217 €9. Hicks, Michael. Edward v. The Prince in the Tower. The History Press. ISBN A0-7524-1996-X. Kendall, Paul Murray. Richard III. W. W. Norton and Company. ISBN A0-393-00785-5. Weir, Alison. The Princes in the Tower. The Bodley Head. ISBN A0-370-31792-0A. External links: Edward v. 1483, The Dictionary of National Biography, Portraits of King Edward V at the National Portrait Gallery, London.